the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm a Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Steve Cadigan. He is an author, future of work thought leader, and he was LinkedIn's first HR officer. Steve, we have so much to discuss, but if you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, for folks listening, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Sure. So Steve Cadigan, he, him. I grew up on the East Coast, actually grew up in South Africa. And then we got kicked out when I was 7 and had to come back to the United States. Professional journey is really, I found recruiting and talent about a year out of college. Had no idea when I finished school what I wanted to be at all. I didn't know what I wanted to do going into school. I didn't know what I wanted to do out of school. And 20 years later, found myself in the best job in human resources on the planet as the first chief people officer of LinkedIn. But I worked in 5 or 6 different industries, had a chance to live and work in Canada for 4 years, Singapore for 2 years, and really fell in love with human resources and talent strategies in technology companies because I found they're much more open to experimenting, the very fast decision-making iteration. And so after I left LinkedIn about 10 years ago, I started helping leaders build what I call compelling talent strategies. And the last 2 years or so, since the pandemic has been here, it has been the most fascinating 2 years of my professional journey. It's been awesome. It's been obviously filled with a lot of challenge and pain and heartache for many people, but the pandemic has afforded us an opportunity to really change things at a scale we've never been capable of even comprehending. And so as someone in the talent world like you, we're all in the change business. We're trying to change something, a behavior, maybe a strategy, maybe a person, maybe, all kinds of things. And in a domain that we're in right now, where everything is changing, the acceptance of, hey, the world's changing, maybe we should try different things, has never been higher. And so, we sit today on this conversation at a really cool point.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much change, especially over the past almost 3 years. Business as usual is not cutting it, and people are looking to talent, human resources, people design folks to really think about how to retain people, how to attract talent, and think about kind of the workplace that we're in right now. I know you wrote a book about the workquake, embracing the aftershocks of COVID-19 to create a better working, a better model for working, I should say. What are some of the kind of exciting innovations in the people space? I know there are a lot out there that make it more efficient for folks to work. I know I'm really excited about the 4-day work week, more mental health days, stay interviews, flexible work schedules to support working parents and caretakers. What gets you kind of the most excited to work more efficiently?
Yeah, you've hit on a bunch of them. I think what the pandemic has served for us is a forcing function for a greater personalization of work. We have to know the personal circumstances of our coworkers now, unlike any time in history. I need to know, are you worried about the education of your kids? Are you worried about the safety of your parents? Are you worried about getting toilet paper? If there's something that's concerning you, it's going to impact your work. And I need to know as your employer, how are you feeling about those things? And that's been a great thing, the pandemic for many professionals who are now working from home who didn't before. We're now Zooming or, meeting up in Google Meetups or Skyping, whatever, into the homes of our coworkers. And we're seeing a window into a world we didn't necessarily have visibility to. And so some of the things that I'm starting to see because of the pandemic, but also probably triggered and started to change before the pandemic, are greater employee expectations of freedom, independence, and autonomy in how and when they do their work. And I think that genie is out of the bottle. People are wanting to have more control over their day and not having to only shop for groceries on Sunday or only be able to get a hair appointment on Saturday, and the joy and the freedom of being able to schedule that when they want to, and also interact with their families in different rhythms than the 9 to 5 workday afforded before. I think it's been a really cool innovation. I'm also starting to see, as it's been dubbed the Great Resignation, I call it the Great Career Migration.
Mhm.
People are resetting what's important to them in their lives. And the employees that left to go home during the pandemic are not the employees today who may be going back in a day, 2 or 3 days a week. They're different. They're changed. How they see the world, what's important to them, where they want to spend their time, how they want to spend their time has fundamentally shifted. We've seen, as many of the listeners have seen in the news, the greatest number of people starting new businesses since we've been measuring that over the course of the last year, and also greatest number of resignations month over month for the last year. And I don't think the end is in sight right now. I think we're still going to see a greater fluidity of work. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but many organizations, and you mentioned it earlier, still measuring their success on retention. And I think we can get into that if you want to. I think that's a faulty objective right now. I think if you are planning to keep your people longer and you're not recognizing the fact that they probably won't stay, so maybe you need to build your business to account for people leaving sooner than they used to, then you're going to start to appreciate, I think, that we have a broken model of work, if you will, that the work processes, generally speaking, okay, at a high level, used to be everything we've inherited today and how we design work and how we design organizations is built for a slower process of production. And now, and this was 10 years ago when I was at LinkedIn, it was 4 hours from your idea to being on the website, 4 hours. And I used to work with companies that were 6-year development schedules to build a microprocessor. And so it depends on the industry, but we're seeing lots of jobs have a much shorter, cycle time. And, having someone stay a long time isn't as necessary or critical because the business rhythms are a lot faster today. So I'm starting to see businesses start to build for, okay, we know people aren't going to stay. How about we care about them for their whole career, not just when they work for us? How about
Yes.
we build something more honest, right? And that's a big part of what I talk about in my book, Workquake.
How do you really build something that is more honest and thinking about the person as a person outside and inside of the work organization? You mentioned people hold a lot of different roles and responsibilities, could be worried about different things that do impact their work. I think people are looking for flexibility, but they're also looking for, I think you mentioned one of your other talks, inspiration and purpose-driven work. And what does, personalization look like at scale when you are working at 10,000 employee organizations and you want to work efficiently? How do you kind of future proof your organization there?
Well, I think you have to start by appreciating and recognizing that talent, particularly knowledge workers, have more visibility to opportunity than at any time in history. And if you think your company is the only place they should ever work, I think you're delusional. And so what we have to do is start to shift from, instead of let's just start at the beginning of a relationship, professional relationship. It's the interview. And I think what we have done traditionally is say, well, here's our mission, here's our vision, here's our values, company. I think we need to shift that as employers, and from the first point of contact, say, hey, Christina, what's your vision for you? What's your mission? Where do you want to go? How can I design an opportunity here that's going to allow you to get to where you want to go, even if it's leaving the company? How can I help architect an experience that's going to benefit you the most? And in turn, I would like your commitment to try to benefit us the most too while you're here. But we know those two are connected.
Yeah.
I taught a class last night to about 15 professionals in Mexico City. And one of the people who's in this class, it's a school that has a small campus in Mexico City. And one of the students said, I had to quit my job to go to school because the company thought I wasn't committed to them if I went to school.
Oh my gosh.
Can you believe that?
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I'm like, well, good for you to have the courage. I'm sure financially that's been a real hardship for you and your family. He's relatively young, sort of his early 20s. But that's a broken model of a company thinking, no, you're not committed if you take time to go make yourself better in an uncertain future. And that's what I mean about, let's be honest. Let's not care about it. Let's not promise someone a job. Let's promise someone a better career. Let's not only care for someone when they're here. Let's care for them for the entirety of their career journey. And let's be honest and recognize that we can't be the be all end all, because we're going to change as an employer. The individual is going to change over the course of their career. And these are just real simple, fundamental conversations that we need to have. And that gets to probably the second big thing when you're asking, how can we modernize our relationship employer-employee? We got to just communicate way more. You know, I tell a lot of companies I work with, if you're doing the annual employee survey, you're not surveying your employees. You're not really listening. It
Right.
needs to be at least quarterly, maybe monthly. And it doesn't mean you have to act on everything. It
Mhm.
means you need to listen. And sometimes, even if the answer is, thank you for your ideas, we can't implement those because they don't make sense, or we don't have the money to do that right now, or we see a different solution to what is concerning you, that's way better than annual survey or a survey where you collect it and you never do anything with it. So
Absolutely.
these are some of the things that I think we can do a lot better as we want to build a better future of work.
And it's super intentional in terms of effective communication, actively listening and demonstrating, even if you can't do something today, you are hearing and listening to employees' feedback and your teammates' feedback as well. In terms of flipping the model on its head and making it more efficient, there are some common workplace sayings that people have said over the past, decade and few years. And I want to get your thoughts on them. I have a feeling you have some strong opinions about them. But the first is, in order for people to do great work, they need to love what they do. Do you believe that's true? Why or why not?
Not always. Not always. I've done great work in organizations that I didn't love, or I didn't love the work, but I looked at it as a problem that I wanted to solve. And so when you can marry those two, that's a great thing. But sometimes there's other factors that I think we consider when we're determining to take an opportunity. Maybe I like the culture. Maybe I like the leader I work for. I mean,
Mhm.
I remember avoiding econ classes in college because I was the son of two social workers, and I was just like, business, bad, evil. And I sort of went into this econ class in college because all my friends were like, this professor's awesome. Just park everything, all your bias at the door around, business and big company. And this his name was Rich Adelstein, and he was awesome. And I don't care what subject he was teaching, it was really engaging for me. And I've learned a lot from people in environments where I wasn't actually in love with the work, but I loved how I was treated. I love my coworkers. I love the products that we were building, if you will. And maybe the work wasn't, as sexy as I wanted it to be, but
Right.
man, I got better because I took on some things that were a little outside my comfort zone or outside of my affection for work zone. So no, I don't think that has to always be the case, because there's so many dimensions that go into work other than the work itself, right?
I definitely believe in those different dimensions and that people are at different points of their career and lives and are looking for different things because we are dynamic. We're not static and always looking for, the work. As you were saying, you could really enjoy working with a leader as well. I've had the privilege of having some really incredible managers, some not so great
Mhm.
managers too, as some folks listening, I'm sure, have experienced as well, which relates to kind of the next work ism, if you will, of people don't leave bad companies, they leave bad managers. Do you think that's true? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think most of the time I do think that's true. I don't know if I'm if I'm a living example of that, but it's not always just leaving a bad manager. It's leaving because they're not listened to, respected, cared for. No one's thinking about their path, right? And the example I gave earlier of the student in Mexico, that company was making it really clear. His name was Jose Maria. We are way more important than you,
Yeah.
and way more important than you getting better. Way more important than you growing. And the sad truth is, what you alluded to a second ago, unfortunately, we learn more from how not to be a leader than we do how to be a leader from a lot of the people out there. And that can take me in a very, very different rat hole in this conversation. But I think it is worth saying, which is I was coaching a friend of mine who's at PayPal
Mhm.
a couple of years ago. He's since left. And he was concerned that his manager was awful. She doesn't listen. She doesn't know what she's doing. And I said, I want you to reframe the situation.
Mhm.
My belief is, particularly in this era of fast paced business, companies are not investing in leaders like they used to. And a
Right.
lot of people are promoted without support, reinforcement, education or mentoring on what it really means to be a leader. So I said, so you have an opportunity to shape her, to
Mhm.
help her, be the manager you want to be.
Yeah.
Don't expect her to be to be great. And it's sad that I'm having to sit on this show with you and say, lower your expectations of leadership people. But
Right.
listen, most companies are not building to be around in 100 years today. They're not. And that's not because they're not smart. It's not because they're not mature. It's because the future is so uncertain. We don't, it takes a lot of courage or belief for you to think your company's going to be around in 100 years, because technology is changing fast and someone could come up with a paradigm game changing model. It's just going to obsolete your business.
Mhm.
Look at how many unicorns exist today that aren't even 25 years old, that are new industries, new businesses, share workspace, electric cars, genetic testing, all these gig economies,
Mhm.
Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, they're all new models with new
Right.
career paths. And so they're building really, really fast and taking out some older businesses. And I don't know that they're expecting to be around in 100 years. So I don't think they have huge investments in building great leaders for tomorrow. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are really naturally good at this,
Mhm.
and they're jewels. And when you find them, you want to stay with them. But I sadly have to, lay it out there that I think, generally speaking, the quality of leadership has been eroding for quite some time now. I don't see it changing anytime soon.
I mean, you talked about the responsibility of the individual to manage up and to really lower your expectations a little bit too, which I definitely, I agree with too. In
Mhm.
terms of the responsibility of an organization, if you had a magic wand or could impart this wisdom onto an organization that is growing quickly and that is hiring or promoting individual contributors to first time managers, what resources, training, responsibility, mentorship should be in place to support the growth of a really great people manager?
Well, the first thing is avoid making the mistake of believing that because someone is good as an individual contributor, that they will be good managing other people doing that work,
Yeah.
or that they want to. And I have had to, unfortunately, resurrect many failed decisions where a organization that I was in put someone who was really good at doing it in charge of other people doing it, and they were miserable and they hated it and they weren't good at it. And what organizations should do, and I think you bring up a really, really important point for our listeners, which is, if you're going to invest in leadership, please recognize that the one place that the employee experience is impacted the most is a frontline manager. They
Mhm.
have more people that they're touching the daily experience of than anyone else. That's where I'd put, if I had a few dollars, that's where I'd put my money, is helping those people learn how to communicate, set goals, give feedback, deliver difficult feedback, and be realistic in how to, employees, I think for the most part, don't want to be told as much as they want to be listened to,
Mhm.
right? And there's a way to steer people through listening and asking, this, what we call the Socratic method, asking questions and steering them. Are you sure that's the right path? Have you checked with anyone else? Is there another way that could be done? Versus do it this way, and that's, that was the spirit behind the most sold book in leadership history, is called Built to Last, which is by Collins and Porras. And it's just interesting feedback. But I think that frontline manager, if I were to wave a magic wand and say, man, that's a place where it doesn't take a ton of investment, and it's probably something that you don't have to send someone to a class to do. Just who are the people that are really good at it, and
Mhm.
have all the people you want to be good at it hang out with that person. Make that person, deputize that person. Have her be the person that everyone gets a chance to learn from. Right. The other thing to do, and this is something you can do through surveys, is ask a question I've never seen a survey ask. But one of my good friends who wanted to change the employee survey business years ago, her name's Sherry Yoakum, and she works at, I think she works at Ernst & Young now. She's just a superstar. And she's one of those people, when I hired her, I'm like, I'm going to work for her one day. She's that good. She said, you know what I want to do, Steve? The culture of a company is really important. I want to ask a question. Who do you go to for advice in your company? No company asks that.
No
you know
company.
and there was a study many years ago Hitachi did, where they took the employee badge, that have the RFID chips on it, and they, to
Right.
be able to access different doors and different, areas of the company. And they unbeknownst to the employees, so this is interesting and creepy at the same time, they looked at the patterns of the high performing teams. Where were they going? Where were they spending time in the building? What were they going? And they found two really, really interesting things.
Mhm.
The teams that were successful tended to have lunch together. Okay. and that there was a bunch of pods in the organization where clusters of people would spend more time than other places. And so then they went like, what's going on? Is there free candy at those desks? Like, why are they going to those people? What's happening? And they found out, hey, that person's giving advice. Now, they didn't answer the question of like, should we make teams eat together and then they're going to be more effective? Or was it because teams that got along more had lunch together more? And that was the really interesting insight. But, we are still not even 50, 60 years into the journey of understanding teamwork and organizations. This is still a really new domain, and we're still learning. And that was probably the biggest takeaway for me when I took my master's of organizational development. It's like, wait a second, this whole field hasn't been around hardly at all. And there's a lot of people with all these theories, and that's just what they are, they're theories. So it is a new space. And that's why I believe experimentation is really important for organizations to find out, what works for you may not work for someone else. I think we're seeing that, interestingly enough, with the pandemic. Companies they're asking me the number one question, Steve, should we go back to work in the office? Should we let people stay at home? Should we do some hybrid? And my answer is yes. And they go, no, which one? I said, yes. I said, the answer is experimentation. And two companies in the same industry may have completely different approaches. The era of benchmarking on how you should work is flawed because your competitor doesn't have the same people that you do, isn't led by the same people as you do. They don't have, they have different ages, they have different sensibilities, different things that are important. And your job is to figure out what's the best way for you to produce value. And it's not going to be the same as your competitor. I promise you that. So don't look to your competitor, what they're doing. Don't look to Google or the usual, benchmarking companies, because you're not in their business. You don't have their people, right?
Absolutely. It's not a cookie cutter approach. There's no playbook and secret sauce as much as people wish that there were. I do want to touch on metrics though and benchmarking, because a lot of folks, especially who are listening to this podcast or visit our webinars, they want to talk about the return on investment and metrics and how you're measuring success and benchmarking, as you were talking about in terms of company culture. I mean, we've talked about frontline managers being culture conduits. That's super important. We've talked about really testing and iterating the amount of experimentation, employee feedback, and listening. But are there qualitative and quantitative ways you can measure company culture, a healthy workplace environment, on a scorecard or on metrics, especially if you mentioned too that retention should not be necessarily one of them?
Yes and no. I mean, the challenge is we're dealing with human beings, and we are really weird creatures that get motivated and influenced and impacted by things sometimes that we think we know the right measure, and sometimes we don't. And so I think that's why I believe probably there are some metrics that are important. Let me talk about one that I've sort of hinted at earlier in the conversation that I think is a broken metric that we use to measure organizational health, and that is turnover. If you look at in technology today, some of the most valuable companies in the world, let's just take Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft. None of those companies' median tenure is over 2 years right now. None of them. Arguably the most valuable, most impactful, in some cases, the most profitable companies on the planet, definitely in the world of technology. So how can you say that long-term tenure is driving disproportionate results? In those cases, you can't. Now, you could say, well, Steve, the data's a little bit skewed because they're on a big hiring ramp, or maybe when Microsoft acquires someone, they restart the tenure to when they started with Microsoft, the data to close the acquisition versus when they joined a LinkedIn or a Skype or soon to be Activision Blizzard. So what, but I think, the bigger question is, are those the right metrics to be measuring, right? Most human resource talent leaders are measured in part by how long are people staying, because we believe, and we've believed over time, the longer you stay, the more I trust you, the more consistent and reliable I know the company results will be, because I know you're going to do your job. But in a world where we know people are leaving faster, and nobody thinks in 5 years, people are going to stay longer than they do today. The trend is coming down. 7 years ago, it was 5 years in a company in the United States for knowledge workers. Today, it's 4.2. And for people between the ages of 25 and 35, it's 2.8 median. In Silicon Valley, probably in the New York tech sector is the same, which is where you're joining the conversation from today. 2 years, it's like, whoa, you're still here? Let's have a celebration. And it used to be like 20 years, hey, dinner with the chairman and the board, and wow, we're going to give you a jacket and a pen set and a clock. And so I think we need to come up with some new metrics around value creation. How are we creating value? One of the biggest metrics that's messed up right now, it starts in the investor community, and that is revenue per full-time employee, per FTE. What's happened during the pandemic? And no one's measuring this because it's impossible to measure, because most of the government tracking is of people on payroll. The number of contractors and temps companies are using is exploding.
Mm-hmm.
Your contingent workforce, which is your buffer to sort of weather storms of like, oh my gosh, we need extra people. Oh no, my gosh, we need to shrink expenses. That's an easier place to do it because you don't have the burden of, oh, we got to take a PR hit. AskBetter.com, how their reduction of 900 people went. We don't have the PR hit. We don't have the, the impact of letting these contingent workers go because they knew they were here for a short time at all. That is another flawed metric. Revenue per FTE. When I believe most companies during the pandemic have a larger proportion of independent contractors helping them, sort of like it's an accordion fungible workforce, and more good talent is going independent than at any time in history. That's a really beautiful, but also interesting development, which renders some of the old metrics we've been using flawed, right? So I know I'm avoiding answering your question by sort of throwing out some different stats, but I think the best is asking questions like, do you feel like you're doing your best work here? Do you feel like you're on the right journey working here? And listen, Christine, I worked in companies where I never wanted to ask that because I knew what the answer would be. No. No. And thank goodness I got out of the HR leadership role, before Glassdoor was really hit its stride in terms of like employees can sort of lay a big bomb around how miserable they are working in your company. But it's hard today, and you have to deliver a good experience because every employee is now a public relations, voice out there, and they can tell the world whether you're a good place or not.
Do you think that, you mentioned a couple of flawed metrics. Do you think that measuring an employee's happiness in a qualitative way like that is a good metric of kind of success, or not something that should be kind of benchmarked on a year-to-year basis?
100% no.
Okay.
I think asking if your employees are happy is the wrong thing to be asking.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to build a great company, you want to be successful, and success means hard conversations, difficult feedback. In HR, why are we like the despised department? Because someone comes to me and says, I want to promote Jim. And I say, no, because Susan and Sarah are way more qualified. And if you promote Jim, Susan and Sarah are going to quit. I'm not going to let you do it. Oh, HR, you suck. But that's a hard conversation. So that person's not happy, but I'm making a really important judgment call here. And so that's why I go, I think a more important measure is trust. Mm-hmm. You feel you can trust your leadership? Do you feel trusted? I think, and there's a guy who's got a podcast called Happy at Work. And I'm like, dude, you got to change your podcast. That's not the goal. And when I recruit HR talent over the course of my career, I go, what's the objective of human resources? They go, oh, make people happy. I go, wrong answer. The goal of HR is for us to win. It just so happens people who are happy are going to want to win more, but the goal isn't happy. The goal is win. Okay. And that does mean we're going to have to deliver some things that people aren't going to want to hear sometimes. We're going to have to make some tough conversations. We really built, I believe, and I'm incredibly proud of the culture that we built at LinkedIn, but that was built on my San Francisco employees were living in the heart of Silicon Valley. They wanted a bus to San Francisco. And I said, I don't think I can afford it, but let me do the research. Did the research, $250,000 to run 2 buses in the morning, 2 buses in the evening, and only 10% of my employee population lived in San Francisco. And I had people in the East Bay and the South Bay coming from longer distances, not asking for a bus. And so I got back to them and said, listen, I know this is really important to you. I have a vocal minority, but you're only 10% of the company. It costs $250,000. We're not making the money Google is to be able to afford those buses. And how would you suggest that I tell 90% of the rest of the population we're not giving buses to because they're not asking for it, that you get this money, which means we're not funding something else that we could do, like a fitness center or something like that. And they said, thank you so much. We understand why you made the decision. Now that's being honest. Did I make them happy with that? No, I didn't. But I built trust. You see? And that's why this whole happiness thing, the same thing on our leadership team at LinkedIn, were we the happiest bunch of friendly people going over and having barbecues at each other's house? No, we were not. But we could really have a healthy debate. And we had passion and conviction around building a great company. And that's something that we shared. But we weren't like, I wouldn't say friends at scale. I mean, some people were friendly, but it was really more like, hey, mutual respect. That's what we're bringing to the table here. And I think that's what people want. Is it nice to have a more friendlier environment? Of course it is. But I think people would rather be with an organization that's winning than it's always happy and we're mediocre. And there's a great, it's not a TED talk, but it's a video of the CEO and co-founder of Eventbrite, who talks about waking up one day in a nightmare that she's created the happiest, most mediocre company in the world. And she, oh God, why is her name escaping me right now? She's wonderful. And she talks about, hey, we're in San Francisco. We're competing for people. We want to be a cool, hip place and put in ping pong and cool food. And then all of a sudden our numbers started dipping and people started getting frustrated. And she's like, oh, it's not about that. It's about winning. And people felt more excited when we had some big business wins than they were about the free food and the beer pong and beer Fridays and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Julia Hartz, is that her name?
Julia Hartz, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I saw her article. I was listening to that as well about just company culture and building I also saw the Harvard Business Review article around if you have a nice company culture, are you moving the company forward? Are you being conflict avoidant? Are you really helping people develop in their careers and providing that difficult, having those hard conversations as well? It's not about that. And in general, happiness, you cannot be happy all the time. So it's not a realistic metric too.
Right.
I think that's definitely interesting. In terms of trust, I think that example was really great in terms of trust and active listening, effective communication. Do you believe the perception of HR people teams has changed over time?
Do I believe it has?
Yes.
No, unfortunately. I feel people today still know more what they don't want from HR than what they do want. I don't think there's enough great models. I've seen some, but I think that's more the exception than the norm of teams. And it's sad. It needs to be better. When I left LinkedIn as probably 10 years ago, as I told you, I was, had lunches with a bunch of mentors and coaches and people whose opinions I really respected. And they said, well, what are you going to do, Steve? And I said, I'm going to raise the bar for human resources. And one of my mentors said, why are you aiming so low? I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, raise it for leaders. Raise it for leaders. And I thought, yeah. And this gets to, something that I think is really important for the audience, which is if you work in a company where human resources owns the talent agenda, you're in trouble. Leadership owns the talent agenda, and human resources should help inspire, be creative, push, hold people accountable. But if you've got and this is why I have a big, big concern when companies say, oh, we've got the head of diverse DEI right over there. And some leaders say, okay, well, I guess I don't need to worry about it because I got the head of DEI over there. Then you've displaced ownership potentially on someone versus built greater accountability. And I think that's a risk when I see, oh, we've got a new head of DEI, the head of HR. They own culture. They own culture. You're screwed if you think HR owns culture. You're really screwed. And you want to make sure something fails in a company, have it be an HR program, guaranteed to fail. It's like everyone's rolling their eyes, maybe not literally, but they're sort of passive aggressively doing that. And I think the best work I've ever done in my career, and I've worked in some really amazing organizations, the best work I've done in HR is when I had a leadership team that was in front or with me, not behind me. And LinkedIn, we had this, and I talk about it in my book, we had a sales leader. Now, sales is usually the organization where HR is like, I'm watching you. You're cutting cultural corners all over the place. That offsite in Vegas, not going to happen. Mike Gamson led every sales conference. He was the head of sales the whole time I was there, and CEO of a company called Relativity today in Chicago. He began had every sales conference be all about values, not about quota, not about closing, not about influencing, values. And people are like, when are we going to know the quota? You get the quota later. We're going to have our kickoff conference be all about who we are and what we're about. and our core values as a company. It was just awesome. I've never seen a sales leader in front of HR and culture. And I look back and say, the cool thing about LinkedIn was half of our company were salespeople. Every field office was mostly sales. When you have a sales leader leading the cultural, evolution, that's beautiful. And then Jeff Weiner, the CEO, and I used to visit our field offices and come back and go, whoa, that culture in that field office in Chicago, that's better than our culture back in headquarters. Like, what's going on? And it was really inspirational. And that's why, we gotta, when you're having human resources, I really believe they're enablers. They shouldn't be owners. And when you have owners there, it's a dangerous place. Also because HR touches so many cultural points in the life of an employee. Who's hired, who's promoted, who gets a salary increase. Those are big, big things. And sometimes when they own facilities, like who gets an office, who doesn't get an office, that's even more. And if you have someone not integrated with the sensibility to understand, is this in tune with what the leaders really believe, in tune with our culture, in tune with our values, you run the risk of problems popping up.
Yeah, I think accountability is huge. I also agree with having a diversity, equity, and inclusion program manager or chief diversity officer. It should be everybody's responsibility to think about creating equitable processes, making equitable decisions, and that enablement of HR for leadership, and leadership in every sense of the word, not just the CEO or chief executives, but also sales leaders and people in different departments, really focusing on goals and values of an organization. Steve, I know we talked about a bunch of different topics today in terms of company culture, the future of work, how not to measure the success of your organization. But for folks who are listening, knowing that people are in different parts of their careers, they're most likely practitioners in people, human resources, diversity, equity, inclusion, again, managers, culture champions. Do you have a call to action or just an insight you want to underscore for them, or anything I didn't ask that you want to share as well?
Yeah, maybe I'll just reinforce something I said at the beginning, which is we have been presented the greatest opportunity of our lifetime to change. The audience, the employees, the leaders of an organization are more receptive to doing different things because they're doing different things at home and at work. And if you want to tackle something big, now's the time. You don't need the usual huge inertia to change something. The readiness is there. And ask yourself, what can we do to create greater value for the employee and for the company? And I think for me, I believe that learning and investing in your talent is more important than anything. Make people better for tomorrow. Don't make people better to make people better for tomorrow. It should be the mantra. And if you make someone better, they're probably going to want to stay with you long, right? And if they leave, they're going to be more of an advocate. This is why I go to leaders and say, do you believe people are going to stay longer tomorrow, next year, and 5 years from now? They say, no, people are going to leave faster. I said, okay, what are you doing to create an alumni strategy so that you're keeping close to a bigger population than you've ever had before of ex-employees? Are you doing anything? No. Okay, why not? And I'm like, well, because they left us. It's like a divorce. Like they, dropped me like a ex-girlfriend or boyfriend. Like, come on, man. Like it's different. And they could be a source of good, a force for positivity in your future. So those are some parting thoughts that I have, Christine, in terms of, how I'd like to frame the psychology. The last one, and I think this is a big one, and I threw this out in a quote on LinkedIn last week in a TikTok I did. And I have a fun TikTok channel too, for those of you that want some comic relief. If your employees, what's that?
We'll link it in the show notes.
Awesome. If your employees are changing and your talent strategies aren't changing, the end is near. And what we've just seen is the biggest change in the psychology of the workforce during the pandemic than we've ever seen. So if you're expecting all your stats in terms of how you're measuring your talent are going to be the same and all your strategies are going to stay the same, I really ask you to rethink that. Rethink. And there's an industry out there, for example, the management consulting industry. They have built a talent model that profits from people leaving for better jobs. The better the job you leave for, the more I can recruit a new grad and say, hey, they came to Deloitte, Accenture, Ernst & Young, and they stayed here for a few years, and then they got a better job.
Mhm.
And now I can hire better because you can see that I'm making you better for the future. It's a
Mhm.
beautiful talent model. But
Right.
most companies say, no, 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 no. It's a sin if you leave the company. And that's a shame, you know? And I was just on a phone call with a friend of mine who just left a huge job in Amazon for a huge job at Microsoft. And he was there for 8 years at Amazon. And his boss, he told me, his boss said, I know there's nothing here that's like what you're going to do at Microsoft. I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited that your time here made you a candidate for something big and juicy. And let me know how I can help you next year and the year after. I was like, whoa, I want to see more of that. You know, that was a beautiful, example that he gave me. And I said, okay, that's going to be in WorkQuake 2.0. I'm going to put that in there. And that gives me hope for the future that we've got evolved leaders that are, thinking about the long term and playing the long game.
Yeah, that evolved way of thinking, that long-term relationship. I think that alumni of an organization are also employer brand ambassadors. People will come to them for years on end and ask how your experience was at AllVoices, how your experience was at, another organization as well.
Right.
And you're right, the portability of talent, which is something I was talking to another kind of individual the other day. It's another statistic for you and for your organization. So Steve, I really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for our listeners at AllVoices, we really believe in employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. We love active listening. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.